So good evening. We heard excellent sort of overview by Susherpa. Thanks, Ambassador Thakur, for this very comprehensive progress that India has already made. I think Sustainable Development Goals, which is the focus of this session, we are trying to bring forward some of the concerns that are there in terms of deceleration that we have seen. What we heard in the previous session and what Susherpa just mentioned, I think the traction for role that developing countries, the great cities that we are talking about, India, Brazil, South Africa, and before that Indonesia, what is it that we can do to push the great commitment that we all undertook in 2015 in name of Agenda 2030 or Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it's not just a matter of finance that is there. It's also in terms of the coordination that is needed, the tier 3 indicators that are still there on the table for us to report back, and also the forthcoming UN series of summits that are there, September 2023, where we would have the Summit for Futures, the special convening that Secretary General has come up with in terms of focusing on Sustainable Development Goals. What is it that the G20 can do? As we heard Jose Rizal Lemuri saying that we need G20. So I think any kind of negative impressions, talks about G20, and that I think can be rejected with the force and the dynamic power that the South would bring on this stage. Prime Minister Modi has already emphasized on the role that the global South can play. And I think together we can play a lot of ways in which we can in a way bring more energy to technology facilitation mechanism for access to technology, at least for the substantive goals. We can bring in more energy in terms of how a new sort of strategy, approach on fragmentation of finance that we are looking at. So technology and finance are the crux. Consolidated efforts by the South would bring in more results and more energy. Today we are extremely limited with our time that is available, and I have very, very eminent panelists with us. Eenam Gambhir, who has been leading the development working group. Her leadership time and again has proved out in terms of how development related issues for which we started with the South Korean presidency are going to be the solution outside the box that captures the finance track. And I think it's important that we address the basic challenges that we have in the development to come out and address the finance related issues which are there. Probably the solution lies in our course correction for the development strategy. So without further ado, let me invite Ms. Eenam Gambhir, the Joint Secretary in charge of the Development Working Group, to share her perspective on Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you very much, Professor Chaturvedi. Thanks to ORF, Samir, and all the colleagues who have organized the wonderful event, this event as well as the last 2 days. We've seen some amazing, enriching discussions over the last 2 days, and this being the last session, I hope we're able to keep your attention and finish it soon, and at the same time leave here with a sense of hope that we do need, especially on this very important topic. Before going further, let me also acknowledge our senior colleagues who are here. Thank you so much, sirs, for being here for this important session as well. Colleagues, I'm very honored to be here and to speak on this issue because as India's G20 presidency has started, we have indeed focused in a very strong manner on the development agenda, keeping in mind what are the needs really of the developing countries. As you know, as soon as we took over the presidency, we consulted all the colleagues of our leadership who are not represented in the G20. G20 is an important grouping, but it's still 20 countries. It's a very influential group, but the agenda and the work that the G20 does indeed has an impact on the rest of the world. And with this in mind, and with the idea of listening and learning, Prime Minister Modi convened the historic and first ever Voice of a Global South Summit, where 125 countries participated. As you can see, we learned, we listened, and we got a sense of what are really the needs of the developing countries as we are going through these multiple challenges. We all here know fully well, we have heard it over the last 2 days, what are the challenges the world is facing. As the challenges and the gaps in the financing, in the resources, in the tools available are mounting, the international governance architecture, unfortunately, is unable to step up. And combined with it also we see a world more and more fragmented. Within this scenario, what we heard from countries about the problems that they are facing, from climate concerns to immediate liquidity that they need, from education crisis to rising hunger, the list was enormous. As well as we heard the solutions from the countries as to what they need. And the fundamental from all of this was indeed the reform of the international governance architecture, a governance architecture which can follow an integrated agenda and enable rather than limit the ability of the countries to find solutions. So if these are the challenges that we are facing, what is the agenda the world really needs? And from our perspective, as Prime Minister Modi has also said, we need a truly inclusive, decisive and action-oriented agenda. A truly inclusive agenda that takes into account the needs of all human beings. And not only that, not only human beings, but also other beings that are on this planet, one Earth. And also an agenda which enables us, empowers us to act on behalf of all of this planet. And this is important because the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us that we are interconnected and our solutions as well as our problems need to be interconnected. That our future depends on everyone prospering and indeed no one should be left behind. In this backdrop, in India's G20 presidency, we are bringing back the focus on G20 contribution to the SDGs agenda in the big manner. We are planning to adopt an action plan on accelerating progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. This will be the second action plan of G20. The first was adopted during the Chinese presidency in 2016. The action plan under India's presidency will focus on not only politically reaffirming the commitment of the G20 and its contribution to the SDGs agenda, it will also focus on the transformative transitions, such as the digital transition, the just green transition, women empowerment, which we believe, and there is evidence to support that will have a multiplier impact on the Sustainable Development Goals and will lead to the progress in a much more fast-track manner. In this regard, as we all also know, there is need for greater coherence not only within G20, between finance track and Sherpa track, between the various tracks of G20, but also the G20 and other international organizations like the UN, like COP, and so many others. So this is the focus with which we are working towards bringing action-oriented plan for progressing on the Sustainable Development Goals. So, just talking a little further on the Sustainable Development Goals as our priority. So what is the Sustainable Development Goal agenda globally? Really a response plan at the time of a crisis like this, as some have said? Or is it a blueprint for our future agenda? And why should we not let it sink? As some of you know, but also I think it's important to reiterate, the SDGs are indeed universal in nature. The recent developments have clearly demonstrated they are adaptive, they are interactive, they can be applied almost to any issue. COVID-19, preventing future pandemics, just green transition, climate action, everywhere we see SDGs provide a solution. They're truly universal in nature and prove that with each passing year. Second, they're indivisible. Dividing them will lead to only future problems. This is also something that's a lesson that we have learned over the last several years. The recent development, especially the pandemic, also demonstrated that the costs to picking and choosing select SDGs are indeed huge. We need to follow all the SDGs in an interlinked manner, especially the climate and development agendas, which both find their space in the Sustainable Development Goals. Third, the SDGs are rooted on the needs of those who are left behind, and that is very powerful. The slogan that we should leave no one behind is very, very powerful and should not be ignored. It keeps our efforts rooted in the reality and like a lighthouse provides direction in the times of need. With this in the background, as we shaped our priorities, we kept in mind not only the aspirations of the countries and the people of G20, but also the fellow citizens of developing countries. As colleagues know, the developing countries are facing multiple challenges at the same time. They are having to deal with their development goals, their growth challenges, the climate challenges, disruptions in international markets and supply chains at the same time. So how is it that we bring focus on helping the goals of the developing countries in a way that there is no trade-off between climate and development agendas? And from this perspective, we feel that with the development at the core of our priorities at the G20, our objective is to galvanize support for what we are calling a Green Development Pact that outlines a development paradigm which enables growth while maximizing the synergies and minimizing the trade-offs between the development and climate agenda, thus powering green transitions which are truly and globally just. The envisaged Green Development Pact will bring to the forefront the solutions for providing financing for climate action, mainstreaming life approaches, leveraging circular economy, implementing green transitions in a just manner, recognizing that there is a need for fair and equitable access to basic needs and enhanced quality of life for all human beings while meeting the climate and environment goals at the same time. The Pact will be powered through investment in sustainable lifestyles, leveraging green hydrogen for climate action, accelerating progress in SDGs. Let me try and unpack some of these aspects for you in the next few slides. So taking first and foremost the just green transition, and that is the challenge as well as the question on the mind of a lot of development professionals and policy professionals in the world today. And that indeed is the core of the Sustainable Development Goals agenda going forward as well, development. So what is the task before us? Decoupling economic growth from carbon emissions while ensuring energy transition that are fair and equitable and are not at the cost of development? Well, let me be clear. There is no country in the world which has developed without carbonizing. There is no model like that exists. So we are aiming here to do something that is really innovative and extraordinary. Extraordinary goals need extraordinary environment and extraordinary support systems. And it is our responsibility to ensure that we create an enabling environment for such goals that we have to fulfill, for such growth models which eventually minimize the trade-offs between development and climate agendas. Individual net zeros are not going to be enough to achieve a net zero Earth unless, and in line with historic responsibilities and differential capacities of countries, we are able to also provide a framework where some countries turn negative before and provide the development space to others which still have to develop as we go forward. And from this perspective, we should also keep in mind the indivisibility of our agendas. We should not end up in a world where our desire to be greener leads us to be more dependent on a few and therefore more insecure. The External Affairs Minister a few days ago had spoken about the task ahead of us of democratizing the world. What he meant by it was to democratize it technologically and democratize it economically. As we move forward, it will be crucial to decentralize, to collaborate, to diversify, in a sense to democratize the world. And this remains a task as well as the question as we move ahead. We need a globally just transition, which looks at the bigger picture and democratizes the world at the same time. Speaking of the bigger picture, it seems very clear that we need an all-of-economy approach, and we need an all-of-society approach, which involves all stakeholders, empowers our citizens also as equal stakeholders in our climate and development agendas, and allows us to focus till the last mile, and that is the life approach. Life enables the evolution of a development paradigm which is pro-growth while ensuring sustainability through multi-stakeholder collaborations. So coming to my last slide, how do we see the way forward? And here, having spoken of the challenges, if the way forward was a puzzle, the pieces of it seem very clear in the background of the theme that has been chosen by a presidency, which is One Earth, One Family, One Future. We need a truly international, inclusive and action-oriented agenda for our future. And we need equity, trust, and solidarity to act as pillars to support such collective actions. Trust and solidarity rooted in principles of equity and acting on behalf of everyone, those who are even not represented in forums like these, will multiply efforts that we will make. In mobilizing the resources and the tools, we would need to ensure that we follow an integrated and inclusive approach, one family. Without trust and solidarity, we do not have collective actions. And for that, we need the resolve to act together for our one future. The task indeed is onerous, and we intend to galvanize the political will for these efforts. Last year in Bali, in the face of such enormous challenges, we were able to bring everyone together, especially when we led with emerging market economies leading the agenda. And we are sure that we'll be able to find the same political will for this ambitious agenda that we have embarked. Thank you so much for listening.
Excellent. Thank you, Eenamji. I think I must congratulate you for the last slide, which you could not get much time to spell out on, but I think it captured the essence of Indian G20 presidency very well. Congratulations for this excellent slide. I think probably in the last line somewhere it may also capture the whole issue of access, equity you have brought in, also of inclusion. So that would, I think, add the AEI that we have been talking about. But let me now invite the head of the UN here in India, Shombi Sharp, for sharing his perspectives on how he sees the decade of action ahead.
Thank you so much. Namaste. It's a great pleasure, actually, and honor, but pleasure to be on the stage with two wonderful friends, Eenam Gambhir from G20 Secretariat and Sachin Chaturvedi, and wanted to thank, of course, appreciate Samir there in the back as well, and the team at ORF, not just for this discussion today, but for obviously the whole Raisina practically week. I mean, it's been a whirlwind, and also to recognize Vice Chair Suman Berry of Niti Aayog and the other colleagues from the G20 Secretariat and everybody here in the room. I also appreciate that it's the last session of the last day, and I think it's actually a Sunday, isn't it, if I'm not mistaken. So all of you for sticking with us. But just wanted to say that, look, I mean, there's been so much conversation here, and you can tell that there's a lot of passion, a lot of optimism, a lot of stress, a lot of pessimism as well. All of these emotions are coming together as we face a confluence of cascading crises, as they say, this senseless war in Ukraine, the deteriorating global economic outlook as we view into the immediate future, the increasing scarcity of the basic necessities of life and the cost of basic necessities of life, especially, not only, but especially for the poorest countries and communities. And this is all coming in the backdrop, against the backdrop of the greatest existential threat of all, the triple planetary crisis. We cannot lose sight on that, on pollution, biodiversity loss, and most of all, climate change. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, just this February, this last month, was the hottest February on record here in India. So we're very much reminded of this fact. So here we are at the halfway mark of the 2030 agenda. And we would argue, and I think, and we've heard from the speakers just now, that the 2030 agenda SDGs remain as relevant as ever as the world's compass for navigating this turbulence. These goals cut across the panoply of challenges, the questions before, including education, gender equality, poverty reduction, eliminating hunger, and of course, addressing climate change. This is the only truly unifying agenda that we have as a world community. And yet, we've seen that the recent crises have actually been wiping out years of progress across the world in terms of the SDG agenda. UNDP's Human Development Index indicators have shown for the very first time ever that human development has declined across the board for 2 years in a row, 9 out of 10 countries. Food Insecurity World Food Program estimates that 350 million people are facing acute insecurities. This is 2.5 times pre-pandemic numbers. Debt, as we've talked about, over half of the world's poorest countries are either already in debt distress or at very high risk. 1 in 4 middle-income countries, home to the majority of the world's poor, are at high risk of fiscal crises. And yet, debt service payments, the price of debt, has increased by 35% in recent months. Now, if we look across the specific SDGs, over 4 years of progress have been wiped off on SDG 1, ending poverty. SDG 2, ending hunger, 150 million children additional are now suffering from stunting. 1 in 4 women have faced increased levels of gender-based violence. And the Secretary General has called climate change code red for humanity. The past 8 years have been the hottest on record. And in fact, in the next 3 years, we have a 50% chance of a year which will already exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. And yet, the SDG financing gap is now more than $4 trillion. It continues to grow rapidly. So as the Secretary General told us on his visit here in Mumbai a few months ago, the SDGs are in urgent need of rescue. Now, there is some good news. Where we look around, there are many multilateral efforts. The Black Sea Grain Initiative was mentioned, is making a difference. 18 million tons of grain have shipped from Black Sea ports in Ukraine. Russian wheat exports have increased by 3 times since the start of the war. This has made an important impact, relief impact on the price of those commodities. Just last night, the High Seas Treaty was agreed at the UN after 10 years of negotiation efforts, placing 30% of seas and protected areas, protecting 30% of our seas by 2030. This is historic. And much of the optimism that we have is actually driven by India, as the world's largest democracy, as the fastest growing large economy, with the largest youth generation, the greatest number of young minds in history. India is uniquely positioned to bring together the North and the South, the East and the West at this moment in time. The Secretary General also said in Mumbai that India will quite literally make or break the 2030 agenda as we look forward to the second half. Up to half of some of the global SDG targets reside here in India, and India is increasingly a development solutions provider for the world. I won't go into too much detail, but we've seen India has been able to lift 271 million people out of poverty in just the last 15 years plus. India is well on its way to providing universal electricity to poor communities across a broad and diverse country. India is leading the way in terms of investing in renewable energy capacity. Now 174 gigawatts, 4th in the world, and increasing every day. And as well as India's robust development achievements, India has embraced the SDG localization agenda more than any other country that I've seen. This fits well with the Honorable Prime Minister's initiative, Lifestyles for the Environment, as Eenam was just sharing with us, as well as India's driving force behind mitigation efforts, the International Solar Alliance, adaptation efforts, the Coalition on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. India's leadership through the Panchamrit targets is driving the global conversation now, and India has long been a leading voice for climate justice, with the historic loss and damages agreement at COP27, a major step forward. And India has given us the Year of Millets 2023, of course millets being a superfood, the sort of investment in agriculture and consumption that we need right now. So the G20, as I mentioned, India has brought a presidency which is uniquely positioned to get us through this tempest, the lighthouse in the tempest, as our ORF colleagues have coined the phrase. SDG acceleration has been placed as a top priority, as we've heard. This is incredibly important. This is exactly when we need an SDG 20, as one could argue that's what we have. Moving forward, India's blending of a record of legitimacy in delivering development solutions and trust and bridges across the north-south and east-west divides is a fortuitous timing as the G20 summit will conclude and will literally handshake right into the global SDG summit as the world comes together and takes stock, and then Summit of the Futures following after that next year. So this is the most important summit for the SDGs since the inception, and I would argue this is the most important G20 presidency as well. The Secretary General has tabled just recently an ambitious new SDG stimulus plan. It's not only the greatest, it's not the only impediment, of course, financing, but financing is the greatest impediment to achieving the SDGs. And the G20 presidency of India is very much pushing forward on this effort. We must get poor countries out of the debt row, staring down the abyss of insolvency and default, killing countries' ability to invest in education, health, clean energy, and the SDGs. Nobody should have to choose between putting food on the table and paying off a high-priced loan. The SDG stimulus outlines the need for the international community to come together to mobilize investments, at least 500 billion annually for developing countries, and converting high-priced short-term debt into long-term, lower interest rates, crowding in, blending in private finance. This will require debt restructuring, MDB, multilateral development bank reform, and the international financial architecture reformed to be fit for purpose in the world that we face now today, not the one that we faced after the Second World War. This is not an incremental change that we need. This is a Bretton Woods 2.0. So to conclude, as we reach this all-important midpoint year, we face a decisive moment in these months, actually. SDG achievement is set against numerous challenges, but let us not give way. Let us come together behind India's G20 presidency, leading the way to the SDG summit in September. Again, as the Secretary General said, this is a unique opportunity. India has a unique opportunity as a principal player, as an actor, as a leader, and a model. I cannot think of a better country to be taking on this enormous challenge, and I have to share Abhay Thakur's optimism that we will get through this. This is a lighthouse in the tempest. Thank you very much. Bahat dhanyabad.
So, friends, we heard the two key presentations for this session. Now we are left with around 20-25 minutes with us, and I have a list of speakers who would be intervening. I would request them to be extremely precise, focused, and no longer speeches than already been discussed with you. And the first name that I have here with me is Senjuti Saha, Director, Child Health Research Foundation, Bangladesh.
Hello, thank you for the presentations. So I'm a molecular microbiologist by training, and I work in the intersection of microbes and public health. So I'm going to talk about health, SDG 3. So when we picture the map of this world, and let's say we color in green where most of the technologies and the latest technologies lie, and we put a red dot for every child that dies, we see that all the green concentrates on the global north and all the red dots concentrate in the global south. In public health, we call this a 10-90 gap. 10% of the resources exist where 90% of the children die. 90% of the technology resources exist where 10% of the children die. And a reason for this is one of the primary reasons for this is our extractive, terrible colonial past. When we talk about SDGs now, oftentimes there are projects, there are research studies that come into countries of the global south funded by big donors. And oftentimes, these are to reach the targets that we want to reach. But what we see is that for a lot of these projects or research studies, the principal investigator still sits in the global north, and the projects are being carried out in the global south, data flowing from south to the north. Really, this is still a vicious cycle of colonialism. So India has been a loud voice in decolonizing, and I really hope that going forward, India will play roles in also not only decolonizing what we have seen before, but the current vicious version of decolonizing global health. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Saha. This is extremely interesting. Now from Turkey, I have Dr. Angor, Associate Professor, Political Science and International Relations, Marmara University.
Thank you.
Yeah,
and,
please.
I'm teaching at Marmara University in Istanbul, and 3 months ago, just around the New Year, I was invited to a conference in Turkey to speculate or to predict the coming challenges of this year, I mean the year ahead. And of course, all of our colleagues, we were concentrating on Ukraine war. We were talking about, of course, the past COVID pandemic, climate crisis. I was just talking about the triple crisis that was facing Pakistan, etc. And then February comes, and we are hit by this, major earthquake. And now I'm looking at the death toll and the number of people. The death toll has already passed the Ukraine crisis, and it is probably going to, be bigger than the COVID pandemic. I mean, the number of people died in Turkey because of the pandemic. And that brought me, this was very, of course, unpredictable. And I should say that people died not because of the earthquake, but because their buildings collapsed. And in the Turkish context, this is not necessarily because of poverty, I mean extreme poverty, or the lack of technology. Therefore, I understand that some of these problems, maybe majority of the problems, are about the domestic jurisdiction. They should be handled domestically. And some of that global collaboration needs to perhaps address issues of accountability, rule of law, transparency, because, ultimately this was a policy choice and it was a political problem. So I'd like to see some of the G20 efforts to go that way, and I'd like to thank India for sending the one of the biggest rescue teams and all the humanitarian aid that they could. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. We very much share the pain and agony that you have gone through, and as we had felt back when India had the Bhuj earthquake here, Turkey was the first country to send assistance here. So Prime Minister just tried to reciprocate that gesture. So thanks for that. Thank you. Let me now invite from Indonesia Esther Tamara, Director of Climate Unit, Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia.
Thank you. So I have three brief points, and I'd like to make it very quick, as I know we are short on time. Firstly, I want to appreciate the G20 leadership of India of consulting the Global South, because often we realize that Global South voices are not represented well in global governance conversations. For example, even in Indonesia, when we talk about the climate crisis, which is my work, for the past 10 years, 90% of the natural disasters that happened is exacerbated already by climate change. So it's not really a far-fetched future, it's already here. And that led to my point, which is number 2, the elephant in the room is financing. Earlier, Mr. Shombi said that financing, we have a shortfall of $4 trillion, but if we break it down country per country, that's about roughly $170 billion. So now the question is that how do we go about raising those money? And I would love for India's G20 presidency to explore what kind of financing tools can we move forward with. In Indonesia, we have taken ownership of this by doing innovative financing, blended financing, SDG bonds and whatsoever, but how do we spread it forward with speed and scale for other countries? And lastly, we cannot deny that the geopolitical climate of our world right now is not conducive for international cooperation. But I'd like to make this point that we cannot reach a net zero world. We cannot reach 2030 SDG success without engaging China, without engaging Russia, who are both at the top 10 global emitters of carbon emissions. So eventually we'll have to talk to them, and we look forward to the G20 India presidency for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Tamara. Very, very important intervention. I would just like to remind you of the slide that Ms. Eenam Gambhir used. She brought out 5 features of the Green Development Pact, and I'm sure they would be responding to you. So thank you. Should we come back to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, please. Dr. Yunus. Yeah.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. I will raise 2 points from our experience as a think tank. At Interregional for Strategic Analysis, we have initiated a program to facilitate and make it possible for cross-regional dialogue between experts, practitioners, and policymakers. And during these discussions, we have encountered a recurrent challenge, which is the lack of data, statistics, and official records in the least developed countries. This seems ironic in an era when we are overwhelmed with information about every aspect of life. But at the LDCs, the situation is different. The mechanisms of data collection and surveying and documentation is either malfunctioning or at extreme cases are not there, are non-existent. India, as a representative of the Global South and with its long-standing history of global initiatives, successful global initiatives, can put this issue on the agenda of the G20 and can join forces with other international organizations and stakeholders to initiate a program for capacity building of entities of data collection and analysis and surveying in the least developed countries, and this will enable more effective public policies and the attainment of SDGs in these countries. The second issue that we want to raise is the achievement of SDGs in the neglected territories, which is areas rife with civil wars, sub-regions controlled with militias, drug cartels, and terrorist groups, and other armed non-state actors. The route to reach these areas is challenging, and it's not easy, and requires a collective effort and the cooperation between members of the international community to restore peace, stability, and development there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Dr. Yunus. Let me now call my very dear friend, somebody who did very heavy lifting in Indonesian G20 presidency, Professor Riyatu. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Sachin, and thank you from sharing also the G20 India progress and initiative. I think my view is the same with the others, that we need for G20 India to emphasize again on open data for the government policies related to SDGs. Especially, we see during the pandemic that the government actually coordinate as well, not only at the central and the local level. They are opening, in the case of vaccine distribution and also social spending. We need to see as well on the context, the framework of overall SDGs, given that the evaluation and monitorings within the government maybe not be an issue, but the issue is the monitoring and evaluation, accountability and transparency directly by the beneficiaries and the communities. So, and in the context of the financings, I think when we the pandemic also show that the effectiveness of policy is also lies on coordination, not only at the central, but also at the local level. And I think in the case of Indonesia, despite of more mandates on spending, we see that the performance is quite better than expected in terms of the tax revenue. So there are also potential of sharing knowledge and between emerging countries with the low tax ratio, and given that the challenge ahead is also quite big. And the last thing, I think, I like to see from the presentations that the investment by the private should also not stopping of doing no harm, but actually doing better. And in this context, I think the government maybe also can have initiative at the region or something that fiscal incentive to accelerate as well as SDGs, and how is actually private investment can be make impact on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Yatu. You have very rightly pointed out from the slide that Ms. Eenam Gambhir used in terms of industrializing without carbonizing. And so that, I think, is extremely important. Let me now invite Dr. Jamuna bin Ahmed, Senior Director, Ministry of Health, Oman. Yeah, please.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the government of India for inviting Oman to participate in such an important forum. In terms of the questions raised, I think in the past few years, the interlinked crises are putting the 2030 agenda for sustainable development in grave danger, along with humanity's very own survival. The confluence of crises dominated by COVID-19, climate change, natural disasters, and conflict are creating spin-off impacts on food and nutrition, health, education, environment, and peace and security. They are all directly affecting the progress of sustainable development goals. With all that is happening, I believed we reached a turning point where we actually need a roadmap for human survival. When it comes to effective climate change, we are now paying the price of the damage we as humans have caused to our own Mother Nature. And I would like to echo here that we need to take from nature only what we need, not what we greed. With all the lives lost due to the pandemic, floods, earthquakes, and emerging diseases, we must not lose more due to conflicts and wars. And here we need to really seriously embark on a path of diplomacy, peace building, and placing humanity first before anything. We need to learn from the opportunities and lessons learned on how to move with innovation in health and digital technologies, and to be able to connect, share data, and reach more. The G20 have given us the know-how and resources. They have to make significant increase in their investments in developing countries. No one is really immune. On health, we need to work together under the concept of One Health to tackle diseases, prevent them from occurring, and reduce the suffering. Great emphasis on the future should be diverted towards robust work at community level. We must listen carefully to people. We need to build community interventions taking bottom-up approaches that respond to their real needs. The pandemic was a reminder to us to leave no one behind and to be able to support the disabled, migrants, children, and elderly. It was an opportunity also for us to partnership within our own countries and with others to develop on technology. In terms of financing, now more than ever, health has become a national matter of security, and we need to capitalize on this and expand investment in health. Firm commitments of national authorities in each country must be translated into action. Clear plans must be prepared to speed up the progress in achieving the SDGs. G20 support is badly needed in many countries, lower income countries where resources are the barrier. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Let me now invite from Thailand, Sutikon Kingsway, advisor, KBU Research Institute.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank India for the hospitality and inviting all of us here to address this issue. This is a very important issue. This is the last session, so before we go into detail, I would like to ask all the audience in this room, how many of any of you, please raise your hand if you are coming from developing countries. Countries. Okay. Let's say it's about 60–70% of this room coming from developing country. This is the same as G20. There's 4 billion people, about 4 billion people, and 80% of them are from developing countries. G20 is a good representation of the world where majority of world population living in the developing world with lacking resource and far from achieving sustainable development goals. When looking into the reasons, one thing I noticed that these goals are very broad and it's not clear how can different countries with different background, different resource, different cultures, different mindsets can all achieving these 17 SDGs. For example, for achieving this SDG, country with rely heavily on subsistence farming would have different development trajectory to achieving SDG compared to countries that rely on manufacturing service and tourist industry. For example, zero hunger cannot be achieved only by improving farming. For instance, countries that majority of households own small plot of land, they cannot rely on single crop farming, risking household are no income or one crop cultivate on that and subject to changing weather pattern, fluctuation in price. Rather, they should try to cultivate different kinds of food crops and livestock that would allow them to sufficiently live on their own land. Then the excess produce can be sold to generate income for purchasing other necessity things in life. For countries that rely on manufacturing, service sector, tourism, the government should ensure that those labor with limited bargaining power can get enough share of any economic and business activities, which mostly controlled by big corporations. This way, there would be enough for them to feed their families. This is example of no one-size-fits-all approaches. To summarize this, we need to rethink about how SDG can be achieved by different countries with different background, different resources around the world. And as the theme of G20 in India is One Earth, One Family, One Futures. For SDG, I would elaborate it as One Earth, One Family, One set of SDG, but customized approach for one future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Sutikon. Let me now invite from Nigeria, from the Kaduna State, Saud Amina Ateobi, the Deputy Chief of the Staff Administration, Governor's Office.
Thank you very much. I'm here. Yeah, it's good to be one of the last speakers because most of the points have been touched on. When Mr. Sharp was giving his remarks, I could just easily put a title there to say Kaduna State because all the indices apply to us. In terms of the way we're looking at improving or fast-tracking the SDGs, I would say from the point of a developing country perspective, just like the last speaker had said, we need to be given agency in terms of the implementation of development projects within our countries. The copy and paste model doesn't work. When we take programs that have been implemented elsewhere and just drop them, they really don't give the results, and those are part of the things slowing us down in terms of implementation. There's several instances, for instance, where boreholes are constructed because they think a community needs water, and in the end it's left redundant because that's not what they need at that point in time. Besides being the Deputy Chief of Staff, I'm responsible for social protection in the state, so that covers SDGs 1 to 8 and 10, and I think we also need to start thinking about the political economy, right? As long as we have politicians in charge, you can't determine, not everyone would have governments like India that is focused on pursuing the SDG objectives. We need to look at the worst case scenarios and design accordingly to ensure that even when we have bad cases, right, the SDGs tie into what politicians want. What do they want? They want to win elections. How do we begin to design the same way we design programs in the bottom-up way to also think and work in the psyches of the politicians that we deal with so that they're able to do what they need to do with the SDGs. About the finances, when the SDG started in 2015, Nigeria's foreign debt stock was about 10 billion. Now we're up close to 40 billion. So it's a vicious cycle. How do we ensure that we have cash transfers to the most needy people while we're collecting loans from the World Bank, from the IMF, and it's just piling. This have implications for health, for education, and all the different sectors. But I'm glad that the UN resident coordinator already touched on that. And we hope that things get better. We don't have any choice but to have an optimistic outlook. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me now invite Nishad Shafi, co-founder of Arab Youth Climate Movement, Qatar.
Thank you. I once again thank Oref and Dr. Samir for inviting us here. Well, we hope SDG delivers. It doesn't have to be how we dealt with Millennium Development Goals. We don't want another goal to come after 2030. And one of the key things we shouldn't forget is the young people. No other country like India knows the immense role of young people. As a youth organization based out of Qatar, we tremendously look at young people, how they can contribute in terms of climate action. We thank India's role in bringing up the loss and damage at COP27 in Egypt, but big question, where's the money? So like the UN resident coordinator mentioned, the big part is financing. And young people are striving in many parts of the world, like the LDC summit just happening in Doha, Qatar, which opened yesterday, also discussing how to bring those countries out of poverty. So many of the goals are still not towards an achievable path, and we don't see SDG to fail because a lot of young people like us believe this is one of the way forward to take them out of poverty, build a better future for us beyond 2030 and thereafter, and getting all the global south countries in this part of the world, and India can do a tremendous role in this, and bringing more and more G20s to least or developing countries is a good example how you can show the real changes happening on the ground, not just looking a role model at the global north, who are also failing badly. Yeah. So let us look at more future G20s in the region where we can also have huge voices from the young people who are actually the future. What are you fighting for? Your kids, right? That are us and my younger ones. So we hope you don't fail us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Nishad. I think now in the last 5 minutes that we have, I would request our two panelists here to quickly respond to some of the points that have come up and also add their own insights. As we heard Dr. Angor mentioning in terms of issues, some of them are more domestic issues which would be dealt within the territories that we are in. But I think there are some global issues, and as we all touched, the goal 17 is the one where scope for our partnership and taking it forward comes in. But there are many other areas where, apart from resource mobilization, some collective rethinking in terms of how and what kind of future we want, and that I think would require a bit of rejigging of our development paradigms and approaches. So probably we would have to do it better, as Ms. Eenam Gambhir mentioned in her slides. So let me start with her and give her the floor to respond to some of the points. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Chaturvedi. Can I use this? Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much, colleagues, friends, for the wonderful points made. I think, one colleague from Indonesia spoke about moving further from do no harm to doing better. And this is also something that I was trying to point out in the slide that we have. Now, I think it's very crucial that we see the work that we are doing going forward in an integrated and customized way, as some of the colleagues pointed out. Financing, just green transition, the challenges, in the future that are lying ahead, are also in a reflection of the fact that the bottlenecks that developing countries face are not always within their own borders. And I think, a colleague from Bangladesh also spoke about the colonization and the impact of that and the imperative of justice. I think it's very important for us when we look for solutions on some of these very crucial issues and to look at the principles that we have been speaking of. We speak of justice, we speak of equity, we speak of common but differentiated responsibilities, but what do they really mean on the ground when they are applied? So for example, just taking an example, I think colleagues know that, for example, our position on carbon taxation, which is across borders, is well known. India is not fully supportive of it, but also speaking in my personal capacity here, I would like to say that when we make carbon policies, or we make policies which have an impact on other countries, let's say if the impact of a policy in a country leads to a certain industry in another country being wiped out, then are we going by the principle of justice, or are we actually turning the principle of justice on its head? And if we agree that we have to follow carbon pricing as one of the measures, and of course follow other measures as well, can we see what happens to the proceeds of those taxation? Can we then use those proceeds to help the country, the community, which is facing the destabilization for that moment, for that industry going out of business? So I think some of these aspects of seeing the principles that the developing countries have speaking of regularly, what do they mean in principle in terms of economic policies, in terms of international cooperation, in terms of how we seek financing, how we structure it. And I think this is also the fundamental argument that we as developing countries are using to say that the international governance architecture needs to see the investments in developing countries and development from a different perspective. It should not be perhaps seen as a debt which a country has to repay, but investment into the future of that country, which is interconnected with the future of other parts of the international community. So I think it is our job, as well as the colleagues here, to see that some of those principles are demystified and applied to all the solutions that we have been thinking of. I think I'll end here. I've just taken more time. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I would perhaps just, there's 1 minute left, talk about two things. One is that I think we're always searching for silver linings. And I would say if there's any silver lining to what's sort of happened, if we look at the last 24 months, that would be that certainly from COP26 to where we are now, that would be that we're having a much more honest conversation as a global community. Now, for very bad reasons, but COP26 was a world still of just green transition means just green, only green. And unfortunately, that was a bit naive and unrealistic. And it only took the reality of the Ukraine war for a lot of high-income countries to realize the minute that their citizens faced troubles to afford heating homes in the winter, suddenly we saw switching back to coal power, to other forms of dirty energy. And so COP27 was a different world. The developing world was kind of saying, look, this sudden crisis for you is the daily reality for our people. We demand our right to development. And if that development isn't financed as in a green transition, we're going to take it no matter what. Now, India, you have countries like India which are doing unbelievable things in terms of pushing the envelope forward on renewable energy, green hydrogen, solar, you name it. And yet, still, because of the poverty profile in many middle-income countries and, of course, lower-income countries, it's simply not possible to switch to green overnight. So the message, it's a much more honest conversation, and we have to do this together. It has to require the high-income countries stepping up not only to the pledges that they made before, but to the 1 trillion, the 4 trillion, what we need now. We're all in this boat together. And secondly, the focus on the non-state actors, as we've said here, and another reason for optimism, whether it's, not non-state rather, but I mean, subnational governments and non-state private sector. You see incredible things happening here in India on the private sector front. So those would be two reasons, I think, to be optimistic. I'll end on the favorite joke of mine. don't recall, was it Vladimir Lenin or John Lennon, one of the Lenins, said, life is what happens while you're busy making plans. And that's what's happening right now as well. So let's remain optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shombi. So a big hand for our 9 panelists who made very powerful interventions, and the 2 panelists. Big hand for them.
And for Sachin.
And also for Sameer for getting all of us here. Thank you, Sameer.